I wanted to share a little bit about my own evolution in terms of some of the work that I'm involved in now. One of the things I'm thrilled about is that I'm actually able to do this while sharing it with my sister, Catherine. Catherine and I grew up. She's here up in Boston. She came down. I'm so thrilled that she's here joining us today. I actually suspect that she'll be here in a future storytelling session for some of the innovative work she's doing on integrative medicine in inner city communities in Boston. But one of the reasons I want to bring her up and us up is because we were very fortunate to grow up in a family that allowed us to have a lot of confidence in trying stuff. And going out and looking at the world around us, our mother's British, gave us a chance to go see the world writ large and gave us a terrific platform of love and support that allowed us to start dreaming big. I talk about my parents in terms of roots and wings. My dad very much pushed us to dream big, think big, where my mom, who's a family therapist, our mom who's a family therapist, grounded us in a tremendous sense of love. But it also requires, I think, as you think about your own journey in life, having some transformative experiences along the way. For me, one of my most transformative experiences was when I was in South Africa in 1992. For those of you who may remember what was going on in South Africa at the time, Mandela had been released from prison in 1990. I was there for the last all-white referendum. This is the last time the whites had exclusive vote of whether the reform should continue or not. And it was a very dynamic, very dicey time, actually. And to be there studying politics and getting actively involved in the squatter camps and townships, I was actually teaching in the squatter camps and townships and playing a lot of soccer through the process, was an enormously empowering experience. But I came back from that and wondering, how do I channel my own passion and energy for social justice and being part of the world around me? And I thought that actually I'd do it through journalism. So I came out of college and I went to go work for CNN. And it was a terrific experience. It sounds very sexy. I was actually the guy at 3 o'clock in the morning scrolling teleprompter script. But I eventually worked my way into becoming a writer for Headline News. But it was actually during that time where I had this also a revelatory experience, because Mandela was elected to president in 1994. I was actually in the newsroom writing about it. And I realized at that moment in time that I did not want to be behind a computer terminal writing about the world around me. I actually wanted to be back there on the streets celebrating this incredible event that I had been so actively a part of 2 years earlier. And so, against all parental expectations and peer pressure and girlfriend pressure at the time, I decided to quit CNN. It's the last time that my parents could easily explain to their friends what I did. And ultimately went on a walkabout. I spent a year traveling through Latin America. I was specifically interested in the idea of education and development and technology, but frankly, I was 23 years old and I was ready for an adventure and to learn about a new culture and learn a new language, etc. I eventually ran out of cash in Santiago, Chile, and I'm a big outdoors guy, so I decided, hey, this would be a good place to set up camp for a little while, and I started figuring out all the different odd jobs I could pick up, and so I found an old kayak, and I patched it up, and I talked my way into teaching kayak lessons at a local university, and I talked my way into a television studio doing distance education programming. But really the fun part of it is I actually ended up meeting this group of artists, and collectively we raised $40,000 of local investment and starting a bar. And that was super fun. And it was this incredible experience because I'd arrived in Santiago with nothing in my pocket other than a backpack, and all of a sudden, a few months later, I had my own bar, I had my own apartment, and I had my own bicycle. And I thought, what else does a guy need in life other than these three things? And then I met a guy who had started his own university. And that completely changed the game. Like, I didn't know you could start your own university. That's amazing. And he became a real mentor of mine and friend of mine. And I asked him at one point, I said, what do you call yourself, right? Like starting your own university. And he called himself a cultural entrepreneur. And I was like, whoa, that's what I want to be when I grow up, right? I love my bar, but I remember this whole piece about social justice, and I really wanted to try and bring those two worlds together into what I now know to be social entrepreneurship. So I came back to the States with a specific idea of becoming an education entrepreneur. I did my graduate work with a focus on that, and I started a little nonprofit teaching leadership education and service to some kids in Washington, D.C. I ended up co-founding an online tutoring company that we ultimately grew to the largest online tutoring company in the country before selling it to Pearson Education a few years ago. Helps to start an amazing school called the E.L. Haynes Public Charter School, which is now one of the top performing charter schools in the city, just doing some remarkable work led by an incredible woman. And I helped start something called Entrepreneur Corps, where we placed 400 business volunteers into 96 nonprofits across the country for a year of service. But when I was really working on this work, I said, you know what, I can do all this really cool work, but at the end of the day, through my teaching and through my entrepreneurial activities and through supporting and enabling other kinds of entrepreneurs, we still have some huge challenges before us. And how do we actually start to close that gap in terms of the complexity of the challenges that are facing us right now in education and healthcare, poverty, and try to figure out ways that we could drive innovative solutions to do it at scale, right? I felt like I was doing my part in my own little world, but where I started to see some of the magic was actually in some of the people around me, and I figured if we could actually unleash the potential of an entire generation of problem solvers, that might be one of the ways that we could begin to shrink that gap, right? That's the only way we're going to shrink that gap. We need an army. We need thousands and tens of thousands and millions of people. We just wrote a piece for Phi Delta Kappa about creating 1 billion leaders. Right? This is the kind of energy we need. We need more problem solvers. And how do we go about doing that? Right? So I started thinking actively about that because I'm really interested in this idea of systemic social impact. How do we drive systemic social change? But what I started to realize, it actually starts by what is you're calling inside of you. There's a great quote by the former dean of the Divinity School at Howard University. He says, "Don't ask what the world needs from you, ask what makes you come alive." Because what the world needs is more people to be alive, right? It starts with this idea of leading self. And then from there, you can begin to build up towards creating movements and ultimately the systemic social impact. I've joined up with the Center for Creative Leadership, where I'm the innovator in residence, and with a colleague of mine, we started to develop something called the ARC leadership model. But it's this concept of how do you actually start to work towards the upper right quadrant of this, right? Both in terms of being able to really live a deeply fulfilling, happy life for yourself, while also having transformative impact in the world around you. What are the kinds of skills and competencies you need to be able to get there? And how, importantly, do we impart that upon the next generation is something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about. And it starts with leading self, right? It starts with this shift of mindset from often the disempowered self, especially with a lot of the kids that I've worked in inner city communities, for example. Martin Seligman talks about this idea of learned optimism. But a lot of our young people in our inner city communities tend to have learned pessimism, right? Learned helplessness versus hopefulness. So how do you shift that to a place where you are truly empowered, and then you understand how to lead with others? Not lead others, lead with others. Matt, I was very struck by your comments there in terms of working with the Afghan community to try to lift up a broader vision of what was possible. And then, of course, this kind of innovation, this kind of impact can only happen if you put ideas into action. You can't simply dream about it. You've got to do it, as we all know, right? Those of us who are really driving this forward. You've got to build up the leadership competencies around this. And these are some of the things that we're doing right now. I teach at Duke University, and I do a lot of work with a group called the Sullivan Foundation. In fact, if anybody are interested, we've actually developed all these leadership competencies in something called sullivancurriculum.org, if any of you are interested in checking that out. But we also wanted to understand from others and learn from others and try to figure out what could we learn from others in terms of our conversations with them. And so we ended up interviewing 55 people for a book to try to understand exactly how they had created extraordinary lives for themselves and how they had created extraordinary impact. So how does Kevin Carroll, for example, in the upper left quadrant of this picture, how does he go from the inner city of Philadelphia to become chief catalyst officer for Nike? Or why does Cory Booker go from being a Rhodes Scholar to move to the front lines of poverty in Newark, New Jersey? Why do people make those kinds of decisions? And how could we learn along the way? So we created a book called Life Entrepreneurs, and actually have now tried to bring that into our curriculum and try to think about ways that we could have these kinds of transformative impacts. But what I started to realize as I was doing all this work is that we might be able to put a lot of energy into creating these really healthy seeds, these dynamic seeds ready to pop. But if we plant them into arid, rocky ground, then they're never going to reach their full potential, right? So I teach and live in Durham, North Carolina. In Durham, North Carolina, you can't take for granted the fact that if somebody's got a really dynamic idea for positive change, that they're going to land in the right community, that they're going to connect with the right kinds of people, that they're going to find their tribe and figure out ways to grow that up. We've got to change these kinds of environments, so we've got to create not only the healthy seeds, but we got to create this really fertile ground to plant these seeds in. And so through a lot of my work now, I've been focused on this idea of not only how do we create more change-making leaders, but actually how do we create the conditions in communities to be able to help them thrive, right? And what do those conditions look like? So I started doing this in Durham, North Carolina. We looked at 13 different communities around the world, tried to understand how there were really dynamic, robust ecosystems of innovation and entrepreneurship, and here were some of the conclusions we came to. One is that you've got to build this talent pipeline. You need a density of talent in these communities for people to be able to find their tribe, right? One of the things I love about coming to Providence is I feel that energy. How do you home grow it, importantly? How do you recruit it, and how do you retain it? How do you create that density? Second is, how do you create the right kind of enabling environment? Connecting these problem solvers with the right kinds of resources and relationships they need to be as successful as possible. They may have the greatest idea, but if they can't connect to the right sources of capital or the right sorts of relationships, then they may never, ever get to a place where that idea, that seed, ever fully takes root. And unless, of course, they evidently meet the magical Deb. So one woman enabling machine, as far as I can tell. All right, but that's not enough, right? How do we actually create this enabling environment, but also how do we measure the impact? What kind of economic impact is this having? What kind of social impact is this having? Because without data, we have a very difficult time on the fourth piece of this, which is really advocating in the right kinds of ways for the right kind of economic policy and community development policy to support this. This has to be public-private. And then finally, how do we share these stories out? Go back to Matt's point. How do we amplify? A good friend of mine, who's also a writer for the New York Times, talks about the fact that problems scream while solutions whisper, right? How do we actually shine more light on those solutions and amplify those solutions in meaningful ways? So with this idea in mind, we have ultimately started to build community development organizations across North Carolina to do precisely this, to build innovation ecosystems. So we started with Durham, North Carolina with the launch of something called Bull City Forward to try to do things like innovating for the greater good, right? Connecting these amazing problem solvers with the kinds of resources and relationships they need to be successful. We've scaled that now to 4 different communities. We're also doing some fun things. So this is an example of one of the communities we built in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's about a 15,000 square foot space. We've got 90 companies working out of that, but importantly, it's a community connector. And we're expanding to do a lot of really interesting things. We just had a big conference, a little bit like this, called Innovate Raleigh, to bring people together, connect people together, raise that flag, right? One of the other things that we're working on right now, which I'm really excited about, is that one of the key things to these communities, of course, is not only being able to create this kind of enabling environment, but to keep people here. So one of the things that a lot of young problem solvers lack is actually a cool place to live when they graduate from college. So we started building and buying a network of houses that are actually houses for recently graduated college students to live in for 11 months to fully develop their ideas, called Think Houses. And it turns out that a really nice model in terms of both being able to take these houses, create these awesome communities, and then being able to take old properties and bring them back to life and have a positive return for investors. So we get this nice win-win-win that are starting to happen. And we're now we're opening 6 more houses this year and hope to have 50 houses in the next 5 years is what our hope is. And we're doing a combination between not only think houses but also teach houses to try to do this for early career teachers in partnership with Teach for America. We're also doing one with Duke right now, which I'm excited about. But one of the other things that I'm really starting to work on right now is this idea that if you look across this audience, it for the most part is white. And for the most part, the community work that we're doing tends not to be as inclusive as it should be, right? So here's an example of what's happening in Durham right now. American tobacco is a very exciting development. It's full of all these tech companies, of a lot of exciting things, taking an old tobacco plant and being able to bring it back to life. But this is less than a mile away. And this is actually in East Durham, which is called the Bullseye, where 6% of the population lives, but 60% of the crime takes place. How do we try to figure out ways to create zones of problem solving and innovation in these communities and connect them into these vibrant hubs? So we're now launching something called Forward Cities and Forward Communities to do a national learning collaborative between Detroit, Cleveland, New Orleans, and Durham to connect these communities with one another over the course of 4 convenings in 2 years. Because each of these cities, as they're reinventing themselves, are really struggling with this idea of inclusive innovation. And so New Orleans, for example, which is 90% African American, only 2% of small business receipts are generated by African American companies, right? That is a significant challenge and significant problem. How do we help these communities learn from one another through this process? So that's why I agreed to Saul's invitation. I'm so glad I did. So nice to be able to connect with this community, because at the end of the day, we have so much to learn from one another. We're all trying stuff to try to make the world a little bit better. And I think collectively, we can do some pretty amazing stuff. Because just to bring it full circle, these are my kids. And I'm excited about their future. Right? But I'm only excited for their future if they feel like they're coming into an environment where they can dream big, where they can be problem solvers, and where they can meet their tribe of fellow problem solvers and live in great communities that love and embrace them, like I think we can create. Thanks very much.